Ex-convicts, what is the worst thing you have ever seen a guard do while in prison? I spent a weekend in a city jail processing facility, not a full-blown jail prison, due to a DUI. Yes, I was a freaking idiot. I got 3 interesting stories out of it. 1. There was a guy in solitary across the room banging on the door. Obviously it's steel, but it still seemed like he might somehow break it. He was screaming. They sold my B crack over and over. I saw 4 guards line up with riot gear and batons and go in. I just heard blows landing, and I saw clothes flying out of the cell. They marched that man out of the cell and he looked like that scene in Con Air where they bag and gag them. I was a little more nervous after that. 2. When in the drunk tank with 15 or 20 other dudes, one dude was sitting on the back of the toilet, that is, where the tank in theory would be, with his feet on the seat. Another guy came up and said he needed to use it. He said go ahead, and just spread his legs. We were all a little taken back. 3. I spent the entire night talking and getting to know 2 different guys. They both seemed very nice, like they were picked up for something stupid. We get in front of the judge and it turns out he had beaten someone within an inch of their life earlier that night. Just goes to show you, you never can tell. On another note, I expected it would be incredibly locked down. However, all the cell doors were open and while you're expected to stay in your cell, in theory you could have wandered all around that area. Kind of surprised me. 2. Is a power move. Once saw a CO stomp the back of an inmate's head and watched the heel of his boot literally scalp the guy. Huge chunk of head meat and hair stuck to a black boot still sits fresh in my memory, yet it was 6 years ago. Same guard was smuggling in spice and H. The inmate probably owed a debt is my speculation. Jesus Christ man, how do you even do that crap? My post is kind of late, but I got out of prison in upstate New York in October. I saw crazy crap. Prison is a wild place. One time there was a fight in my pod. After fights they have everybody stripped down to their drawers and their cubes so the COs can walk around and do body checks to see who was in the fight. Well, the people in the fight wore gloves so their hands were fine. One guy's hands were shaking. They asked him why. He said he was cold. They said bulls and took him to the day room. We hear him getting beat for a solid 5 minutes, then a van came and picked him up. The next day I heard from somebody in my vocational class they took the guy the COs beat to another pod and 5 minutes after he got there claimed there was a fight and did the strip search again, then beat him in the same manner and brought him to the box this time. Another thing I saw happen was in the yard. Somebody was smoking K2 and passed out. Well, while he was on the ground the COs started kicking him and they had to take him to the hospital. Prison is a crazy place. Highly recommend not going. Cheers for the recommendation. I had a friend whose brother was a prison guard. He had some stories, but the only one I remember was a time when there was a prisoner in solitary for a while who had become very attached to a praying mantis that had somehow made its way into his cell. The mantis lived with him for quite some time and he loved it like it was his friend. One day a prison guard who wasn't aware of the mantis being important to this prisoner stepped into the cell, saw the mantis, and promptly slammed his hand down on it to kill it. The prisoner was, understandably, devastated. This is so sad. Ex-convict here. There's a long list of fricked up crap that I've seen, and it's hard to really say which was the worst. Rape and assault is obviously the worst out the gate, but there's a lot of close seconds because of how long the fricked up things would last. Forced semi-starvation is one. Being in lockdown in our cells for weeks or months at a time without being allowed into the commons meant we basically lived as if in solitary confinement. Usually got put on lockdown because someone fricked it up for everyone, but sometimes it was an unwarranted lockdown. It came with a whole host of issues, but lack of food was common. Meals were passed through the doors on trays during lockdown, accidentally forgetting 3/4 of the meal portions on specific trays, or forgetting certain cells trays completely would mean that an inmate would get just enough food to survive, but would be slowly starved. It was usually just a specific CO who had a grudge against a specific inmate, versus a collaborative effort. But knowing that you're going to not get at least 2 of your meals for the day and having no alternative way to get out of your cell to procure food for weeks at a time was awful. There was also something we call tile therapy. It was when a CO would decide that you needed an attitude adjustment and would do a takedown. tackle, to restrain you, to take you to solitary or your cell instead of simply cuffing or even verbally escorting you. If an inmate fully warranted it, it was not referred to as tile therapy. Tile therapy specifically referred to the hyper-aggressive, completely unnecessary, and violent nature of the takedown in proportion to the offense that determined the need for a takedown. It usually involved smashing the inmate's face into the tile during the initial tackle, to stun and subdue them, but would also include a variety of battery and such. For example, a CO once broke an inmate's jaw from slamming his head into the tile floor so hard during one such takedown. I don't even remember what the dude supposedly did because it was something so minor, like not having his uniform shirt tucked in, and there was just so much coercion and manipulation and crap in general. COs had the power to make your life a living heck if they so desired, and they had a plethora of creative ways to punish you on the books and off. I served 8 years, so I have a lot of stories. I'm a CO, and one of the worst things I ever saw was an officer kidney punch a handcuffed inmate. Naturally, I reported it. That officer is now a deputy warden. Specifically, my deputy warden. True story. Sucks good people like you can't get that position, instead some animal does. I worked at a max facility and I was super respectful. No need not to be ever, and the men there were always super respectful back. It's frustrating that other officers didn't realize this and administration didn't realize that the same officers who kept having issues were having issues because they were starting it. I really enjoyed my job. I was super strict because I have a fear of getting in trouble. I communicated well and seriously never had issues. My favorite memory was I was working straight 16-17 hours shifts for 27 days in a row before I was scheduled for a major surgery. The inmates knew because it was a small prison and no one keeps their mouth shut, lol. But I was sitting in the guard box on the yard and I looked at my watch and it was 1700 and blinked and it was 1800 and an inmate is tapping on the window, letting me know second shift was on so I wouldn't get in trouble. I obviously didn't mean to fall asleep. I was just exhausted. It was just a super nice thing to do. Turns out that if you respect someone, they might just respect themselves. Thank you for being a good person. We should rehabilitate people, not endlessly punish them. Thank God I never had to go to county, but did spend a day night in the bookings in NYC, Queens specifically. I got busted cause I was in a vehicle with someone doing drugs. They were hitting a pipe and the Tactical Narcotics Task Force, TNT, was parked right across from us. Dude threw his pipe at my feet as the D's were running up to the car. He wouldn't claim it as his, so they charged everybody in the van. There was 3 of us, handcuffed in the back of a white panel van with no windows and a little seat. No way to stop yourself from falling over when they hit the gas cause everything is slick plastic. We were the first ones arrested. They drove around doing busts for 3-4 hours until the van was full. Crack dealer, dope addicts, etc. The crack dealer had swallowed his pieces of crack thinking that would save him. He still got arrested. After an hour he's not looking so hot. Sweaty, huge pupils shaking. His bags busted open after he swallowed them. We end up getting the D's attention and they finally take him to the hospital. From there we go to the precinct for like 4-6 hours. Chill in a cell, nothing special. Next was Queens bookings. First cell there was like at least 75 people. They take all your info and blah blah. There's a dude in the cell talking wild loud. I got shot 10 times in 1989. I can't control my bowels. I need help going to the bathroom. CO I need help. Nah dog, no help coming. They just walk right by. Now he's getting agitated. I'm finna crap myself, he says. Everybody's going wild now. 75 dudes like, CO you'll better take him to the hospital or the nurse or do something. 2 minutes later we all smell it. Olay boy, crap all over. Now everybody really going off, lol. Dude sees a CO coming and scoops up a turd and hurls it at him as he's walking by LMAO. I've never seen the gates open so fast and so many COs rush in and uke somebody up, holy frick. The rest of the night was uneventful. Got a quick halal bologna and mustard and fruit punch and slept on the floor till I saw a judge. Got out the next day roared. Wife's brother was in Rikers in the 1980s. He said the guards mostly ran much the same as prisoners, in gangs with each other. They intimidated and ostracized and threatened violence to other guards who didn't join in or didn't approve with what they were doing. So there wasn't much of a good cop or bad cop dichotomy so much as there was a bad cop and a silent cop dichotomy. This involved working with prison gangs to organize beatdowns, rapes, and murders within the prison. They also were the ones to run the drugs into the prison. From what I understand, it was just corrupt and awful to the bone in every way imaginable. Anyways, while rape was everywhere in the prison, actual homosexuality was looked down upon and guards generally brutalized homosexuals. In one instance they had a drag queen. They stuck a baton up their butt and beat him on a pretty consistent basis, and would have other prisoners come in and rape him in his cell while they held him down. Guy ended up having HIV, and it spread to a bunch of guys who raped him. In response to this, the guards asked a gang to find the drag queen and murder him outside of the prison. They tried, except the drag queen ended up killing one of the people who tried to murder him, and he ended up back in prison for that, where he was tortured again and then finally killed. Now, he went back to prison in 2011 to 2014. He said it was radically different. Still awful, but much less chaotic and violent than it was in the 1980s. New York City in general is a lot less scary and violent than it was in the 70s and 80s. A friend who did time in a federal prison told me that the intimidation by the guards is far worse than that by other inmates. For the feds I would say so, because people in fed prison are not always hardened criminals. You'll have a prison of hard asses, then a prison for white collar crime, then a prison for pedophiles non-violent. Supermax is bad. You have to be a tough bastard to work or live that. The other two aren't crap. It'd be easy to intimidate someone for those. I watched a guard wink and turn his back before I was multiple raped whilst in juvenile detention. Bastard made jokes for a week about my sore butt 48 years ago. That's the worst thing I've ever read on Reddit. One of my favorite things to do was toss cells looking for contraband. It was like a treasure hunt to me. I always was very respectful with inmates' stuff. It could be what most would perceive as nothing, but I respected the inmates' belongings as I would want someone to with mine. If they had a clean locker, I would move things and then arrange the on their bed or another already searched area neatly so when they returned to their cell, they could put things back neatly and efficiently. I had prisoners requesting that I do their checking when it came time. I did my job well, and was known for finding a fair amount of contraband. Now I had a co-worker who took what you might call the opposite approach. If he could break, ruin or destroy property, he did with glee. He'd open food packages, accidentally spill, throw out photos or anything of the sort. I watched him throw an inmate's legal folder in the toilet and in a separate incident, tear up photos of an inmate's kids. He was in butthole. I reported him naturally, but was basically told that I should appreciate his tenacity. I only lasted 6 months in that environment and was glad to switch roles to being the GED teacher, which was way better. I never understood why exactly the inmates weren't allowed pictures of their family. It always sucked finding photos while booking them in and having to put them in their folder to be given back at release whenever that would be. However, I did find one guy yanking it to a picture of what I assume was their much older wife. Definitely not their mother. Number. Surely not. I won't say where and when, but when I arrived, the staff opened 2 cell doors to an empty day room floor. My cellmate, not having much to do except be nosy, stared out the window. It happened quickly, but he immediately recognized what was going on and matador crap, here we go again. I went to look. From one door appeared a one-armed skinhead who walked towards the only other cell open. A kid, alone in his new cell, poked his head out to see why they cracked his door. He saw the skinhead and froze up. The skinhead pushed him inside and fricked him up. I later found out it was stage fighting by the guards. Well, that seems perfectly logical and not corrupt whatsoever. Our COs were pretty human. We had a little guy, probably 5'3", who was pretty arrogant, but we all figured that it was probably because he was afraid. Note, minimum security state prison in the late 70s. I'd generalize, this is pretty much the majority's opinion. Watch while my friend Gus had a heart attack and refused to call 911 4 hours after he was dead on the floor of the dorm. Only did so after a bunch of us got together and ordered her to. He was long dead by that time and could not be revived, and had been in prison since the year I was born, 1988. for a murder back when he was married, killed the dude his wife was cheating on him with, who was also his boss at the time. I was in prison for 2 years, found guilty of mugging. I didn't do it, it was my sister, and had a cell to myself. I'm a 24-year-old woman and at the time was 16. The guard by my cell would always try and flirt with me and would come into my cell and touch me. Fast forward about 8 months, maybe 12 AM. Everyone else was asleep and to my dismay, so was the night guard. That officer opened my cell and quietly crept up on me in my sleep. He grabbed my shirt and tried to rip it off, and when I punched him he grabbed my pants. I screamed, which woke up the night guard. I don't know much of what happened after that. All I know is the dude was fired, sent to prison, and I was put with a female night guard. Moral of the story: prison guards can do pretty bad things. Geez, I'm so sorry. When I was on holiday, my mate got ill. He was in the pad opposite me and was bright yellow. Late one night he gets on the cell bell and the screw says, "Yeah, what's up?" Bloke says, "Boss, I feel really weird and I can't breathe properly. I've got pains all over. I think I need a doctor." Screw tells him, "I'll send a note to healthcare in the morning." Bloke was crying, and he was a big tough gypsy mother, and says, "Please boss, you have to get me help. It's bad." Screw tells him to go to sleep. Next morning our wing was not unlocked. Geezer had died of renal failure and sepsis at 6 AM as guard oldn't be bothered with the hassle of calling an ambulance. Same Screw stopped 4 of us attending his service in the chapel too, as we worked in the kitchen and he wouldn't allow us to go. Hope he rots. I was transferred up north, 3 hours from home, and was one of the few southerners in a northern UK prison. On my wing was a guy who quite obviously suffered from mental health. I was told he used to be quite normal but had been in a motorcycle accident which had left him scarred physically and mentally. Officers openly made fun of his unusual behavior and bad hygiene but never really made any effort to help him. He also had epilepsy and as a result used to put a mattress on his floor so if he had a fit in the night, he wouldn't break his neck when he fell off the bed. Now, officers have to carry out a roll check every few hours, but it's fairly common for them to not really check on the prisoners but to just open the observation flap and close it again once they saw the inmate was in fact in the cell. One night, the officer doing roll checks saw him on the floor on the first time round and left him there. There were 2 more roll checks before morning and no one checked he was okay. When morning came I woke up to hear an officer who had just started his shift desperately performing CPR on the poor guy. He was crying. The guy had been dead for hours. His family were permitted to see his cell but not before the officers conveniently cleaned it up so as to give the impression he was living in much better conditions than he actually was. When I confronted the officer cleaning the cell about the illusion they were trying to feed the guy's family, he said it's not for them, it's for the next poor sucker that would have to live with the smell. LOL. I still think about that pose. No doubt he probably still goes on living his life happily, but I hope he doesn't. Former CO here. My shift was the best on unit but we had problem officers. One comes to mind thinking back. This particular officer would carry razor blades hidden under his name tag, rubber banded to his vest. When he was bored, he'd drop one in front of a cell on a round, next round kick it under, and the last round would pop the slot and spray the offender, calling for backup, claiming there was a suicidal offender attempting to cut himself. Another incident, we had a guy who was being held in the holding cell in the hallway. He was quiet, not sure why he was there in the first place, and the hall really kept to himself in general. Mental health patient, and I'm assuming he was on the autism spectrum. No issues with any officer across the whole unit. This officer walked by, looked into the cell to make sure he was fine, and popped off and sprayed him with his gas, claiming the offender was trying to hang himself with his 2 large boxer string. I was on cameras that particular day and watched all of it. Offender was sitting in the cell doing nothing, twiddling his thumbs basically, and the officer was just freaking bored again. I reported it but no investigation happened. This officer and I were not friends. My breaking point was when he turned on me. He sprayed his gas on his hand covered with a glove and speared a thick layer across my face and neck right before I did my round, about to walk into my pod. Needless to say, after I was done with our screaming match, reports to the head warden and our supervisors, he was put on his own probation period and under investigation finally for what he did to me, and being the only officer on shift with 5 times the number of any one of us 30 using our gas on offenders. I don't know what happened to him. I left shortly after because I moved cities. I hope he is gone. Officers like him are the worst people and a disgrace to the criminal justice system. I loved my job and everything a good officer is supposed to stand for, and unfortunately there are so many just like him in every facility across the country. He is probably working in a pet store torturing puppies or something. He seems like an a-hole, and will be an a-hole regardless of what job he is working. Not my story but from someone I know. Jail or prison, I'm not sure which, in the 70s. Every night the guards took the mentally handicapped girl into another room and gang raped her. Every night. And none of the inmates helped her because then you'll be in the room with her. I once saw a man in segregation who was detoxing from alcohol have a seizure in his cell. The COs who responded arrived 6 deep in full riot gear with tasers and electrified riot shields. Shock shields. I watched 6 grown men repeatedly electrocute and assault a man having a seizure for resisting. Don't know if it's the worst thing, but the guards blackmailed my family in the visiting days so they could see me. The price? An overpriced 3L Coke, $80 approx, sold by the store inside the prison, run by the cartel. So yeah, it was cold tough. My dad worked at Pelican Bay, a max security prison in California. He worked there since it opened pretty much and retired a few years back, so I've heard a few stories. 1. There was a guard in SHU, secure housing unit, who was hooking up with inmates. She was actually my dad's ex who I met, so that was interesting lol. 2. A prison gang fight broke out in one of the yards with almost every inmate involved. It went on for a long time. There are pretty well recorded video of it, before they have enough PPL to shut it down. One guy got stabbed about 20 times and survived. 3. Lots of crazy stabbings. One guy had his throat slit and also survived. 4. The only excessive force story my dad ever told me about was an inmate gassed one of the officers working SHU. So it's already an inmate in max security who's probably never getting out. Throws pee and crap and anything else he can in a guard's face. The SIRT team comes in to do a cell extraction. It's 6 guys in riot gear lined up behind a dude with a riot shield with the sole purpose of fricking him up. After they beat him into submission and drag him out of the cell, they proceed to smash his body into every wall imaginable on the way out. My dad wasn't SIRT team. He worked the control tower, so he didn't say what happened after, but I'm sure it wasn't pleasant. 5. Probably about 10 years ago now, California banned smoking in all prisons, so a bunch of guards were busted smuggling in cigarettes. And more recently, before he retired, guards were busted smuggling in cell phones. My uncle and one of my cousins were in Pelican Bay, separate times. They did not have anything remotely positive to say about the experience, but they're also both huge pieces of crap, and the cousin died last year during a police chase. I worked as a CO for about 6 months. The worst thing that I saw was an orca fat CO steal a couple Little Debbie oatmeal pies and some Snickers from an inmate's cell during a cell search and eat it as he searched. This disturbed me for 2 reasons. First, inmates have little in the way of property and little snacks can mean a lot to them. Second, this guy was so frickin' fat that he struggled to get into the cell. When I worked at a state prison, there were COs who got caught having sex with inmates. When you're frisky, you gotta do what you gotta do, but you can't do any better than an inmate at your place of employment. Blood rushed to the wrong head there. A prison in Ill had a guard getting caught giving the inmates BJs for cigarettes, not giving them cigs to blow him. He was giving them cigs so they would let him blow them. Everything from just beating the frick out of inmates, to popping an inmate's cell door open for another inmate to pull a surprise attack. One time this one CO let this riot go on for a hot minute before he called first response. South Carolina prisons are fricked up. I know a girl who was a prison guard, and she said that the male prison guards were awful to her, like wanking in front of her and sticking together to lie about her to the bosses. The prisoners themselves were nice to her because the biggest baddest one, who was a cannibal, looked out for her after she asked him for advice about cooking meat. No joke, the cannibal was a butcher by trade. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.